One thing about this group, once they start celebrating, it's hard to get them to stop. So, now, really, isn't it wonderful to know that we have peace with God and peace with one another? But that's what we enjoy as the people of God, right? Because we are the people of God, called out from the world, chosen by the Father, redeemed by the Son, being transformed by the Spirit, and journeying together to that great day when the reign of Christ fills the earth. Well, this morning, I want to confess that I love hiking, and particularly I like hiking when it's a bit dangerous. My favorite hikes are those where there's a slippery slope involved. You know, it's the kind of trail where if you get off the path very far, you're going to be stumbling and tumbling to a certain disaster. Some of my favorite hikes have been on mountains like these. This one's actually in Iceland. I haven't done that, but it reminds me very much of a hike I took in Italy along a ridge just like this, and it was indeed the kind of slippery slope on both sides that if you got off the trail and onto the slippery slope, you were headed for disaster. My wife thought we would die, but she kept with me. Or there was this mountain that reminds me very much of a hike I took in Yosemite National Park, a 3-day backpacking trip where we ascended Cloud's Rest and up a mountain called Half Dome. And along the way, the path becomes very narrow. And if you get off the path, you're on a slippery slope that'll bring you to disaster. Or then there was this one here, another hike up a very slippery slope in northern Ethiopia. This wasn't exactly from Ethiopia, but it looked just like this. And I remember thinking that, oh, if I slip, I'll be on a slope off the path, and it'll come to a disastrous end. Now, you all think, well, what a way to hike, right? When we see images like these, our senses are that indeed there's danger involved. If you get off the path, there's a slippery slope that could come to a disastrous end. I don't have to work very hard to convince you of that. But this morning, of course, we're not really concerned about taking hikes on dangerous trails. My intention is for us to become aware, acutely aware, that there is a spiritual slippery slope. And if we get off the path and onto that slippery slope, it has the potential to bring us to a disastrous end. When I think about hiking in a mountain, that one's easy for us to believe, but when I start talking about a spiritual slippery slope, you and I think, nah, that can't happen. I mean, that couldn't happen to me. I'm a Bible-reading, frequent praying, kind of family-loving Christian person. I couldn't find myself on a slippery slope. Or we might think about our church, which God has blessed so greatly, and certainly we might think of other churches somewhere in the world and other eras might go down a slippery slope, but not Centerpoint Church. It couldn't happen to us. But I want to suggest to you this morning that for all God's people, we must live with an acute awareness of the danger of the slippery slope. This morning, I want us to explore that danger, and what we're going to do is first of all, just look at the reality of a slippery slope that could bring a spiritual disaster. We're going to explore the possibility that can even happen to God's people, and I hope to convince us from the Scripture that indeed it is a reality. And once you establish that reality, we'll look at how does a person end up on the slippery slide? How do you end up off the trail and headed toward a stumbling and tumbling disaster below? And having looked at the reality and and then how we get falling down such a slope. Of course, we want to ask, how would we avoid it? What do we do to make sure that we stay on the path and not go stumbling and tumbling to a disastrous end? We'll do that this morning by looking back once again at a story in Israel's history where they had such great victory as the people of God. Wonderful things were happening, but they got off the path. And one of their leaders took them in a direction that wasn't so good, and they ended up on a slippery slope at a disastrous end. Like Israel, we want to learn from the mistakes of the past so that we can avoid them in the present. So we're going to be looking at another story in the life of Gideon, our third and final look at this man who God used, but who also had a problem in how he led the people of Israel. So the reality is this that we want to explore. God's people can stumble down a slippery slope of disaster. Hear me well. God's people can. It's possible. It's a reality that we can hit a slippery slope and head toward a disastrous end. This is what happened to the Israelites, and I want to show you exactly what happened there in Judges chapter 8. So if you'll join me, please turn in your Bibles to Judges chapter 8, and we're going to see, I'm going to take you to the end of the story first, because sometimes it's good for us to understand the end, and then we can take a look back at how they got there. So we're going to look at Judges chapter 8. We'll be looking at pretty much the whole chapter, but we begin in verses 24 through 27, where we see a disastrous end to the leadership of Gideon for these people. Exodus chapter 8, verse 24 speaks of how Israel ends up worshiping a garment. A garment. A piece of clothing that leads them eventually to worshiping an idol dedicated to a false god of the Canaanites. Chapter 8, verse 24. And he, that's Gideon, said, I do have one request. He's speaking to some of the people of Israel who had approached him after his victories. And he said, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder. It was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. So Gideon is asking the people, hey, you know those earrings that we got when we defeated the Midianites, also called Ishmaelites? What I'd really like is like every one of you to give me that gold earring. And so they respond with, verse 25, they answered, we'll be glad to give them. So they spread out a garment, and each one of them threw a ring from his plunder into it. So, seems pretty harmless, right? But watch what Gideon does with those gold earrings. The weight of the gold earrings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, about 45 pounds, and not counting the ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the king of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. Verse 27, Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. And all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there. And it became a snare to Gideon and his family. Now, if you go to your favorite department store, the Kohl's or Dillard's or wherever you do your shopping, and if you ask the attendant to show you the latest ephod, they probably can't help you. But I can. An ephod is a garment that was reserved usually only for priests or kings and priests, kings who held a priestly kind of function. And this one was made out of gold and special linen. It would have been like a vest, apparently, that the king or the priest would wear. And it was often connected with someone who could speak an oracle from God. Gideon is taking it on his own initiative to create a priestly garment that would give him a status of someone who could really rule over the people under God. And the people respond by worshiping it. He sets it in his hometown, maybe in a nice trophy case, maybe on what was the former altar to Baal that he destroyed back in chapter 6. And the people come and worship it. What a disaster. How ironic that the place where Gideon had destroyed idols, he now places an object that becomes an idol. And for those of us who know a bit about the history of Israel, this event will trigger in your mind another time, in fact, the only other time when gold earrings are mentioned in the Bible. It's in Exodus chapter 32, after Israel has been delivered from the Egyptians. They've experienced this mighty deliverance. And what happened when Moses went up on Mount Sinai and he was gone too long? The people led by Aaron took their earrings and threw them to a pile, and out came a golden calf that they worshiped. The language here is written to remind the reader of the rebellion that is happening to Israel in Gideon's day. Verse 33 then explains how the disaster went from worshiping an ephod to a national apostasy of worshiping Baal and his idol. Verse 33, no sooner had Gideon died that the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals, and they set up Baal Berith as their god. Are you kidding? I mean, after what had been this mighty victory of God, they end up setting up an idol called Baal Berith, the covenant with Baal, the name of a Canaanite storm god. In fact, the text says that it became a snare to Gideon and his family, a word that's only used in association with trapping people in idolatry, trapping people in false worship. And if you're sitting there thinking, wow, what a sad story, you'd be right. It's a shocking fall. Because just a few verses earlier, Israel had experienced one of the greatest victories provided by the Lord. You remember the story, right? That with just 300 men, Gideon had been sent to conquer this massive army of the Canaanites and the Amalekites. And he went not with a sword, but with trumpets and lanterns, torches. Why? Because then the Lord would come and fight the battle and throw the people into confusion. And the Midianites, they killed each other, and there was a great victory for Gideon and for Israel. And you'd think, after that, surely now things are going to go well for Israel. And in just a few short verses, Israel stumbled down this slippery slope of disaster. If you jump back to chapter 7, verses 21 and 22, you'll see the recognition that all of this is by the hand of the Lord. Very important for what's going to happen going ahead. Chapter 7, verse 21 says, each man held his position around the camp, and all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. So here's the great battle. Verse 22, and when the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. And the army fled to Bethshittah toward Zerah as far as the border of Abel Meholath near Tabah. They fled. Why? Because the Lord made it happen. What a great victory. And somehow between 7:22 and 8:33, the nation ends up in a terrible disaster. They went down a slippery slope. In fact, they lost the presence of the Lord. And they turned into a situation spiritually where they're chasing after false gods. May I suggest to you that such a stumbling is possible for God's people in any era. How easy it is for us to kind of dismiss this as, well, that was a real problem for Israel. I'm glad we're not like them. But my friends, we can stumble down. I don't know exactly what our disaster might be. The issue for us is not the nature of the disaster, but it's the reality of the danger. Israel did not stop being the people of God. God still claimed them, amazingly. So whatever disaster might befall his people, we're not talking about God rejecting his people forever. What we're talking about is a life that is not lived in relationship to the Lord as it should be. And it's real. You see, churches can stumble down a slippery slope to spiritual disaster. Think about it. We know of churches in Europe, once grand places where the Lord was worshiped and Christians were singing loudly, and now with the passage of time, they're desolate, empty cathedrals where God is not found. Or we know of churches in the U.S., perhaps especially New England, where revivals once flourished and they now stand as museums to a century from long ago. We know of recent churches on the West Coast and a church in Houston and perhaps even some churches in Dallas where the gospel seemed to be declared with great vitality in a day. And now their doors are closed, or they've shrunk to a shadow of themselves. You see, it can happen. I don't want to imply that every church that closes its doors has fallen on a slippery slope. There can be other reasons and other factors, but this is true, that the people of God can experience a disaster by getting off the path. But it's not just churches, it's also individuals, like Gideon himself, can stumble down a slippery slope to a spiritual disaster. These are the Christians who were once on fire for the Lord Jesus. They seem to have a dynamic walk of faith. They seem to be certainly being used by God to do great things. And before the end of life, crashed in disaster. We've seen it happen with young people. They go to a Christian camp, a summer camp. They have a campfire experience. They dedicate themselves to the Lord, and they come back, and they're a voice for the Lord Jesus in their school, and they become very interested in Bible study, and they're active in their youth group, and somewhere along the line, they hit a slippery slope, fall into disaster. It happens to pastors, church leaders, those who are involved in vocational ministry, and they seem so influential in the lives of others. And we could probably list a long list of stories of disaster that we've heard. The point here is not to call out individuals. It's to recognize the reality of a slippery slope for those who go off the path. It can even happen with older people who have lived long lives of dedication to the Lord. And they seem to have bulletproof faithfulness, only to find themselves at the end of days slipping, stumbling, tumbling to a disastrous end. My friends, the slippery slope, it was real for Gideon. It was real for Israel. It is real for us. But the first step to avoiding it is understanding how you get there. So if you want to be on the slippery slope, I can tell you how to do it. Actually, God is really good because he reveals to us in this story exactly what Gideon and the Israelites did to find themselves off the path and stumbling and tumbling to their own spiritual disaster. So that's what we want to look at next. In short, How do you get off the path and onto a slippery slope? It's by pursuing self-exaltation. It's by pursuing self-exaltation. It's by taking every opportunity to begin to say, you know, I'm pretty important to what's happening here. And if you read carefully the story of Gideon, which we're going to do, we're not going to look at every detail. We don't have time to unpack every line, but I want to show you the highlights of what happened with Gideon and Israel so that we might grasp that it is in the process of self-exaltation, both for the man and for his countrymen, that put him on a slippery slope to a spiritual disaster. So let's think about three ways that Gideon demonstrated this. And the first is that he enlarged his troops. He got more soldiers and downplayed his dependence on the Lord. So Gideon's self-exaltation comes because he strengthens his army and he downplays the Lord's role in his victory. We're in chapter 7 again, back to verse 23, and we'll kind of find out how this all happened. Chapter 7, verse 23. This is right on the heels of the great victory that they've experienced. Verse 23 says, Israelites from Naphtali and Asher and all Manasseh, next two words, were called out. Who called them? Gideon called them. They were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. And verse 24, Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as from Beth-barah. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, third time, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth-barah. So here you go. It looks like a really good military strategy. Let's call more troops. We can really make sure we get rid of the Midianites. But there's one great problem. The whole point of the text has been, Gideon, you've got too many men. Remember what happened? Gideon started off with about 15,000 soldiers. He had called them. In fact, the text says back in chapter 7, he sent out messengers, exact same line. He sent out messengers to bring in troops from Israel, and God said, you've got too many. What? Why? Because the Lord said, I know that if you have a strong army like this, you will boast that you're the ones who delivered you from the Midianites. That's back in chapter 7, verse 2. Just to remind you how important it is, the Lord said to Gideon, chapter 7, verse 2, you have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. And what does Gideon do? As soon as he has the chance, he goes and gets more men. He builds his army, and he calls them out, and he says, let's go. Now, if that was the only detail we had, we might not think that's too bad. But immediately, the trouble starts. For you see, that's going to cause a disturbance in Israel because the people who are called are going to gain victory, and they're going to start pointing out their status. The Ephraimites get called, and they actually are able to capture some leaders of the Midianites. It's there in verse 25. It says, the end of verse 24, so all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan, and they captured two of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeeb, and they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and they killed Zeeb at the winepress of Zeeb, and they pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. Hey, Gideon, look what we got. You can just smell the sense of self-exaltation from the Ephraimites. We did it. Now, chapter 8, verse 1, the Ephraimites asked Gideon, why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian? And they challenged him vigorously. Literally, they contended with him, which is a word that's really important because when Gideon first knocks down the altar to Baal. He's renamed Yerubbaal, let Baal contend with him. And now these people, Israelites, are contending with him. They have become like the Canaanites. They were called by Gideon, but it's like a bacteria that has invaded the army because they're status seekers. And so they complain against Gideon, why didn't you call us originally? Now, what would the right answer be? Why, I didn't call you because the Lord told me to reduce the number of my army. I didn't call you because the Lord delivered us. I didn't call you because the real victory comes from the Lord. That's the right answer. But that's not what Gideon says. Instead, he exalts them and downplays the role of the Lord. Verse 2, he answered them, what have I accomplished compared to you? Flattery. Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer? Now, he is from Abiezer, and what he's basically saying is, hey, the thing that you did, isn't that so much greater than anything I did? Wait a minute, Gideon, you fought for the Lord and defeated the entire army of Midian. God gave Oreb and Zeeb, the Midianite leaders, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you? Status, exaltation, and a reluctance to say it was the Lord's hand at work. You see, what's happening here is Gideon is playing the self-exaltation game, and he's allowing Israel to do the same. And in fact, this is the beginning of a process of leaving the path and getting on the slippery slope. That's the first demonstration of self-exaltation. It gets even more intense, perhaps in some ways more complicated, in the second demonstration, where Gideon exalts himself over his enemies, whether they're Midianites or other Israelites. He's going to put himself in a position of superiority that's really quite uncalled for. So we got to summarize the story, and it's kind of a lengthy story. Let me see if I can use a map that'll help us, if I can find my, here we go. So Gideon has been battling the people up here near Mount Tabor and Mount Herod, and that would be like in Frisco, okay? So about 45 miles away, and now he's come down along to this point, and he's called the Ephraimites down here to come and meet him and help out along the Jordan River in this area, and that's where they capture these two commanders. And now the text is going to tell us that Gideon and his 300 men, having trekked from Frisco to the Jordan River, with probably not enough food. They didn't use LBJ, so they're out of food and tired and hungry. And they're going to come over to this first little town of Sukkoth. And they're going to ask for help. Because when you're the general of an army and your men need help, well, you can ask for bread and they should give it to you. And Sukkoth people will not. And so then he's going to go down the road. He's going to go down the road. I think I accidentally just lost it. Will it come back? I lost it. They're going to go down the road to another little, magic. Okay. They're going to go down the road to another little town, not too far from Sukkoth, called Penuel. And they're going to do the same thing there. Hey, give my men some bread. And the people of Penuel say, no, what have you done? What kind of, you don't have any show for your, you think you're the king? Why should we give you bread? You haven't done anything yet. And so now Gideon seems quite driven by a desire to prove himself, to demonstrate that indeed he has the right and the authority to get bread from the people. And so what does he do? He keeps chasing and pursuing. And he goes to a place we don't even know where it is, called Kokar. They're clearly out of Israel. And indeed, they are chasing the Midianites because he's on a quest You can turn that off, thank you. A quest to show his superiority over his enemies and then also over the Israelites themselves. So we pick up the story in verse 12 and find out what happens when he catches up with these enemies. Verse 12. Zebah and Zalmunna, those are the two kings of Midianite that he's been chasing. They flee, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. Verse 13. Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle by the path of Heres, and he caught a young man of Sukkoth and questioned him. So you understand what's happening? Now he's going back the way he came. He's going back toward Israel, back toward the Jordan River. He's at Sukkoth, and he says, now I'm going to get you guys since you didn't support me. These are Israelites. And so what does he say? He caught a young man of Sukkoth and questioned him. And the young man wrote down for him the names of 77 officials of Sukkoth, the elders of the town. Now, you just stop there for 1 second. You might go, man, 77 elders in a town? I mean, that's quite an interesting list. Why would the author give us that number? Kind of interesting. There's only one other place in the Old Testament where the number 77 is alluded to. And some of you will remember back in Genesis chapter 4, a man named Lamech, who writes a little poem about how good is his vengeance. And Lamech will say this: if Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Meaning he's going to go kill 77 people because they offended him. And now Gideon goes and finds 77. Probably the author is indicating that this man is driven by a vengeance to exalt himself and show he has authority over his fellow Israelites. So they're flying along here, and he comes back, verse 15. Gideon came and said to the men of Sukkoth, here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me, saying, do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men? He took the elders of the town and taught the men of Sukkoth a lesson. Literally, he threshed them by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. And he pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of that town. Now think about this. These are Israelites who doubted the status of Gideon. And Gideon returns. He doesn't just scold them or teach them. Instead, he humiliates them. And he kills them. And he exalts himself. The pathway to a slippery slope is paved with self-exaltation. This kind of behavior will continue as Gideon exalts himself through killings. In verses 16 through 21, he's going to publicly execute these 2 kings from Midian. And one of the fascinating elements here is the way that execution takes place, because he brings his son, his young son, Jether. Now, why would a man bring his son and say to him, you kill him? Perhaps because Gideon is already making plans for his son to be a king. The king has the honor of executing the kings of a foreign army. But Jether won't do it. And so Gideon himself is going to have to draw the sword. And look what happens in verse 20. Turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, kill them! But Jether did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and was afraid. Verse 21, Zebah and Zalmunna, the 2 Midianite kings, said, come on, Gideon! Show us! Do it yourself! And then this amazing statement, as is a man, so is his might. Show us what you're made of, Gideon. Now again, you might think, yeah, that's kind of a common conception, except for one important thing. That concept of you are a mighty warrior, Gideon, where did that start? Back when God came to Gideon in chapter 6, and he says to Gideon, you're a mighty warrior. And Gideon says, no, not me. And actually, he's right. He's not. He's only a mighty warrior because God fights for him, because God shows up, and God's whole answer is, I'm present with you. You're not really the mighty warrior, but I'm going to make you a mighty warrior, and I'll deliver the enemy into your hands, right? And so what does God do? He sends Gideon into battle, and he battles for Gideon, and Gideon never even has a sword. He doesn't use a sword. He uses a torch. Right? And he uses, what do they have? The lanterns, right? The torches and the trumpets in order to win the battle. There is no sword. And now what happens? Show us your might. And Gideon has to draw a sword. He's not depending on the Lord. And he slays the kings publicly, so that he can say to the men of Sukkoth and Peniel, see what I've done. Self-exaltation. It's the pathway to a slippery slope. Gideon has his victory, but it's come from self-exaltation, not from the Lord. Calling his troops, humiliating his enemies, and then, even thirdly, he's going to show his self-exaltation in becoming a king. He is going to be one who indeed says he doesn't want to be king, but he ends up becoming like a king. He's going to take the ornaments off the camels so that people will see whether they're on his neck or his camel's necks, or, I don't know, maybe hanging from his Mercedes. They're going to see, oh, you're our king. There's no mention of the direct activity of the Lord in any of this. It's so shocking because everywhere else in the story, it's the Lord who is at work. The Lord comes to Gideon in chapter 6. He speaks to Gideon. He accepts his sacrifice in chapter 6. The Lord leads Gideon down to the place where the Baal altar is and helps him tear it down. The Lord, it says, directs Gideon to reduce his army in chapter 7. It is the Lord who brings the fight in the Midian camp and before that to hear the dream of the Midianites themselves. But from that point on, there is no mention of the Lord's direct activity. None. Gideon will talk a bit about the Lord, but there's no statement from 722 onward that the Lord did anything. It seems the author is saying, this was all about Gideon. I will pursue. I will capture. I will make it happen. I will show you. You will see my might. It's self-exaltation. Gideon accumulates many wives, has 70 sons. 70. Surely one of them could be king. One of them he has illegitimately through probably a Canaanite woman living in Shechem. And his name was given by his father, that son. Gideon named one of his sons Abimelech, which means, my father is king. What did Gideon want? He wanted to be recognized as the man in Israel. He will die with a eulogy that's very mixed. A eulogy that says, oh, Gideon was the man that God used to lead us. He lived to a ripe old age, and that would all be true. God uses weak and foolish things. But his eulogy would also say, he didn't finish well. he finished with self-exaltation on a slippery slope. And with him, the nation went to a disastrous ending. But once again, I'd suggest to you that the same reality is true for us in the 21st century. The way to get off the path and find ourselves on a slippery slope is through self-exaltation. It is when we step forward and we try to make a name for ourselves rather than for the Lord who has positioned us there. It happens when a church, for example, tries to grow through gimmicks, going through crowd appeal. It can step forward and be very self-exalting. Or it happens when a church seeks to be successful by manipulating people for their money, or selling a blessing, or perhaps hiring the most charismatic staff so it'll be very appealing to people. It can look like just a good pathway for success, but in fact, it's self-exaltation that puts a church on a slippery slope. We don't want to go there. We have recognized now that there is a reality of a slippery slope, and how you get there is indeed by self-exaltation. Let's talk for a couple minutes about how to avoid it. How do we keep from the slippery slope? May I suggest that we avoid the slippery slope by always exalting the work of our God. By always exalting not ourselves, but the work of our God. A couple of pieces of advice that will help us here. And the first is very inward looking. It's a recognition that we must discipline our own pull towards self-exaltation. We're born with it. The Apostle Paul will call it the flesh. It is our desire to make a name for ourselves, which starts all the way back, at least in Genesis chapter 11, and runs through the rest of the Bible, that human beings have this tremendous desire to exalt ourselves. We want to be like God, which of course was the temptation for Eve. Deep within all of us is a desire for affirmation that ends up becoming a desire for exaltation. It starts with the little child who scribbles all over her paper and then says, Mommy, look what I've done. Daddy, let me show you. To the teacher, look at me. And yes, that child needs affirmation, but that little desire will now be fanned into a flame of exaltation, so that by high school it's the grade point average or the looks that become so important. And then the athlete who scores the touchdown or hits the winning free throw is standing with his beating his chest and saying, look at me. I'm really needed. We don't have to teach people to do that. We have a natural bent. And so the pathway that we choose requires this discipline of a desire for self-exaltation. It's an ongoing awareness that that's in our hearts. And if we fail to mind it, we're moving off the path to a slippery slope. But we redirect that desire for self-exaltation to God exaltation, so that we recognize and affirm over and over again that it is God who is at work. So when our witness for the Lord results in somebody coming to Christ, we would say, it was not my evangelism technique, it was not the words that I said, it was not my fancy apologetic, but it was the Lord who opened their eyes. When our church is growing in size and growing in impact, we're not going to be able to say, it was our website, it was the cool programs that we had, it was the money that we raised. No, it was the Lord who brought the increase. We were commended by other believers for some good work that we've done to help them, we respond by saying, the Lord has used me simply as a channel for blessing from him to you. It's the work of the Lord. Redirect your self-exaltation to God exaltation, and you'll avoid the slippery slope that brings us to spiritual disaster. You can call me crazy. I really do like those hikes where the slopes are slippery and steep all around me. But I will tell you that when I encounter one of them, I go with my eyes wide open. I know the dangers. And I walk very carefully. Because you know, when you get to the end, there's something so deeply satisfying to know I made it and didn't fall. How wonderful to know that as we navigate our Christian lives, we do so carefully, exchanging our self-exaltation for God exaltation. And in the end, we will look back and say, how satisfying to know we stayed on the path for his glory. And so, Father, we thank you that you have warned us from your word. I pray for myself, for my friends, my brothers and sisters, that you will indeed help us to avoid the slippery slope. Lord, where we need to battle self-exaltation, help us to do so. And may the work of the Lord in our midst be praised, now and forevermore. For Jesus' sake, amen.